I want to talk now about the relation of the term Lord to Jesus in his earthly ministry. In the context that this suggests authority, it suggests that he wields enough authority to demand obedience. Matthew chapter 8, a leper comes to Jesus and he says, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus says, "I am willing." In Matthew chapter 8 also, a centurion in Capernaum, a Roman soldier, comes to Jesus and says, "Lord, thy servant is suffering great pain." And Jesus, of course, heals that servant. In John chapter 9, Jesus walks by the pool and he sees this man who was born blind and he heals him. And the man gets into a bit of trouble with the authorities and they say, who did this? Who healed you? And the man said, "Well, I don't really know. It's that man Jesus." "Who is it?" "You'll have to ask him." And then he goes on his way, still puzzled about who this Jesus is. And finally, the man is confronted by Jesus himself. And Jesus says to him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the man says, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" Obviously, at that point, he does not have a deep or saving faith in Jesus, but he has a very high regard for Jesus and addresses him as Lord. One other illustration. In the upper room on the night before Jesus' crucifixion, when they observed the Passover first, and then Jesus instituted what we call the Last Supper or the Lord's Supper. He indicated to those gathered around the tables with him that one of you is going to betray me. And what do they say? Do they all point to Judas? And say, "There he is. He's the one who's going to betray you." No, nobody does that. Each one of them says, "Surely not I, Lord. Surely not I." So they address Jesus as knowing that he has authority, demanding obedience, and yet it is at the same time a term of respect as well as authority. Now, as you move on through the New Testament and begin to examine more closely the life of Jesus, you see this progression of the idea of lordship. We began just with a common term of courtesy. It becomes then a term of authority, of respect, and then now it begins to move into the arena of recognizing that Jesus is more than a man. He is someone very special and authoritative. And so we come to several instances where it's right on the borderline. You don't know whether they understand what Lord means or not, but they might. For instance, Jesus encountered a Canaanite woman, Syrophoenician woman, and she was concerned about her daughter, and there's an interesting exchange about the crumbs from the table being given to the puppies, and you know the story. Well, in that particular story, she encounters Jesus with this remark, "Have mercy on me, Lord, O thou Son of David." You see, she knows enough about Jesus to know that he is a descendant of David, the king, and that's somebody very special, but she has not probably yet come to have a genuine saving faith in Jesus. So we don't know whether she's using the Lord, the term Lord, with that deeper meaning, or whether it's simply still a matter of respect. Same thing is true when Jesus passed through Jericho on another occasion, and two blind men came out. And they said, "Lord, have mercy on us, thou Son of David." Well, did they know that he was God? Probably not. They'd heard about his healing ministry. Were they calling him simply Mr.? No, it's more than that. because they add son of David. And so it's a borderline case. Not sure just how deeply they understand what his lordship is. Another instance is in the 8th chapter of John, where the authorities bring a woman before Jesus who had been caught in adultery. And after that interesting exchange there, and all the rest of the accusers leave, Jesus looks at her and says, "Did no one condemn you?" And she answers, "No one, Lord. No one, Lord." I have an inkling of an idea that she had met Jesus prior to that, and that she knew something of who he was, and she perhaps had a saving faith in him. I don't know. Maybe not, because of the circumstances. But anyway, she uses the word Lord, and Jesus replies, "Neither do I condemn thee. Go thy way." Well, Peter coming to Jesus, wanting to come to Jesus when he was walking on the water, stormy sea, "Lord, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus tells him to come. But he uses the word Lord. Now, how much does Peter understand at that moment who Jesus really is? It's kind of hard for us to get our minds around the fact that there is a developing awareness among even the disciples as to who Jesus really is. We sometimes jump to the conclusion, well, first time they met him, they knew he was God, the Savior. Probably not. Probably not. They knew early on that he was somebody very, very special. And as they began to follow him, they began to grow in their understanding of who this was. And when they were on a bit of a vacation up in Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus is talking with the disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" Well, they answer in various ways as to who people were saying Jesus was. "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answers, and I think voices what the others were thinking and feeling in their hearts. "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replies to him that flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but the Father revealed this to you. But here, perhaps for one of the first times, if not the first time, the disciples come to a full awareness that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So there is that development as to who the Lord is there. And then there is a fascinating passage, and I want you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. Verses 42 and following. Well, verse 41 will begin there. "Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, 'What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?' They said to him, 'The son of David.' And he said to them, 'Then how does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord,'" by the way, he's quoting from the Old Testament here, so you'll notice that the word Lord is spelled with all capitals. "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put thine enemies beneath thy feet. If David then called him Lord, how is he his son?'" Enigmatic passage, but apparently Jesus is saying, "I am the Lord. Equate me with the one whose name is spelled all in capital letters." Not just some derivative from God, but God the Lord himself. So Jesus begins to flesh out their understanding of his lordship. Jesus in Matthew 12 declares that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now don't pass over that quickly, because that has great impact. What does it mean? The idea of keeping the Sabbath law was one of the central features of the Pharisees and Sadducees' adherence to the Mosaic law. That was sort of symbolic of keeping the whole law. And Jesus said, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, the context of that, of course, is the disciples were walking through the wheat fields, or grain fields, and they plucked some grains of wheat and rub it in their hands, and they ate it. And the authorities very severely criticized them for doing that. And Jesus says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, I am the one who has authority over the entire law, even the law of the Sabbath, which was exceedingly important to them. So he claims to be in authority over the Old Testament law, over the Mosaic law. And that's an important point. Well, he is in authority on so many ways, in so many places, but the strongest evidence that Jesus is to be considered and considered himself to be the Lord in the fullest sense of that word, fully authoritative, is that wherever he went and whatever he did, he acted in such a way as to command authority and obedience. Whatever he said and did, he spoke with authority. Who is this that speaks with authority, not as the rabbis? And so this is his exercise of authority in his ministry, in his life. And I want us to explore that just a bit. But do you have a question before we go on? Any comment or question? All right. He has authority in all areas of life, and let's name some of those. First of all, he has authority over sickness and disease. Now, you don't have to go far in the Gospels before you can find multitudes of illustrations of that. In the opening chapters of all of the Gospels, that's plain. In Mark chapter 2, for instance, they bring a man to Jesus, 4 men carrying his pallet, man paralyzed, lying on that pallet. They let him down through the roof, and Jesus speaks to him. And we'll come back to what he said in a moment, but he heals him. Man gets up, walks out. He has authority over disease. In that chapter right before that, Mark chapter 1, Jesus goes home with Simon Peter. And those of you who have visited Palestine probably have visited the reputed house of Simon Peter there in Capernaum. Its foundations are still there. And it was in that house, most likely, that Jesus one day met the mother-in-law of Simon. And when he met her, she was sick. Luke says she had a great fever. Now, that's a medical term. I don't know how you'd translate that into English, but it means that Luke, writing about it in his gospel, discerned that it was a serious situation. It was a very dire situation. She was really sick, and Jesus healed her. He had authority over her illness. One of the most remarkable times, and this is one of many illustrations, Mark chapter 8, when a leper comes to him. We can scarcely imagine the consequence of that. We perhaps would best think of it today in terms of Ebola. It's a totally different disease, but if you were confronted with somebody that you knew to have Ebola, you'd begin to back off, wouldn't you? You'd say, I don't want to be close to that person. I certainly don't want to touch that person because it's transmitted by touch primarily. So we'd back off. In Jesus' day, leprosy, and that was a generic term for many different kinds of skin diseases, but one of the worst was what we call Hansen's disease now. And the law said, the Mosaic law said, you can't come within, it's either 6 or 8 feet of any other person. You have to keep your distance. And if you get close to a person, you have to call out, unclean, unclean, and back away from them. Here was somebody who was totally ostracized. He could not go into the temple area. In fact, he couldn't even go into the synagogue to worship. And in most instances, he was not allowed to go into his own home to be with his family. He was totally isolated. And yet, he comes to Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He reaches out and touches him. Something that nobody else would dare to do. Because here is one who has authority even over the disease of leprosy. Jairus had a little girl, was 12 years old, desperately ill. He sends for Jesus. Before Jesus gets there, they say, too late, no need to come. She's dead. But Jesus, paying no attention to them, goes into the home with the mother and father and 3 disciples. And he stands there by the bedside of Jairus' little girl. And he speaks to her, and I wish that they would translate into English what he said. They leave it in the Aramaic, Talitha Kumi, Talitha Kumi. But if you translate that, G. Campbell Morgan says the best translation is, little lamb, get up. Little lamb, get up. And he raises her up, and she's alive and well. Authority and power over illness. A woman comes to him in the great throng and the crowd of people and reaches out, timidly perhaps, touches the border of his garment, one of the tassels of his garment, and she's instantly healed. Jesus did this over and over and over again because he had then and has now authority over sickness and disease. Question? All right. He has authority over the unseen world of demons. There is an unusual clustering of occult activity around the ministry of Jesus. You need to read the stories in light of that. The demons just seem to come out of the woodwork during the ministry of Jesus. Now, that's not the only time, and I'm convinced that they are still a reality today. But their activity is not perhaps as widespread in most areas of the world as it was in Palestine in that day. But there were several instances where Jesus encountered demonic activity. One of the most notable of those was in the land of Gadara, perhaps on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And he met there one or two. Different Gospels, one of them has one man, another one has 2 men. Doesn't matter really. He encountered the Gadarene demoniacs, wild men. They had tried to chain them and they couldn't keep them bound up. They had isolated them to a cemetery and they wouldn't stay there. They would attack people. And so it was a serious situation. Jesus comes there and meets this man, casts out this legion of demons, and the man is sound and in his right mind. And by the way, he says, I want to go with you. I want to follow you. And Jesus said, no. I want you to go back to where you live. Witness there where you live. One of the strange instances where Jesus answers prayer with a no. I want to come with you. No. Go back there. There are a few instances like that. Well, there was a man with an unclean spirit even in the synagogue in Capernaum. Why did he come? Did he come to worship? Did he come to make a fuss about something? To disturb the worship? We don't know. But he showed up. A man with an unclean spirit, demonic. And Jesus healed him. Mark chapter 1. So he has authority over disease and over demons. He also has authority over the elements of nature. Just the created world around us. In the 6th chapter of Mark, we see Jesus having taught for some length of time a great crowd of people. He says to the disciples, they're hungry, give them something to eat. And they say, well, we don't have anything except a few loaves and fishes that this boy brought with him from home. Jesus said, pass them out. He blesses it, distributes it among them. He can take even the little bit of material things and can make it enough to share with 5,000 men on that occasion. Well, this is authority. This is power. There are several words for power in the New Testament. One is the word dunamis. You've heard the pastor use this word a number of times in sermons. We get our word dynamite from it. It's that kind of power. There's another word, exousia, which means authoritative power. One who can say something or give an order and it has to be carried out. Jesus has both kinds of authority or power. And then there's the occasion, which I love the story of the stilling of the storm. When Jesus is asleep in the rear of the boat and the disciples, these weathered seamen who knew the Sea of Galilee by like the back of their hand, were scared to death because their boat was about to capsize. They wake up Jesus. Master, carest thou not that we perish? And Jesus wakes from sleep, stretches out his hand, and he says something that in the original is really interesting. He says, like he's speaking to a dog, be muzzled. And the waves lie down at his feet, and the wind stops its blowing. He is Master, Lord, Kyrios, over the elements of nature. Obviously, he is also Master or Lord, Kyrios, over sin. I referred earlier to the paralytic brought to Jesus and let down through the roof. He healed him physically, but there was something else he did that was even more significant. Son, thy sins are forgiven. Who is this that claims he can forgive sins? The crowd said. But he did. He spoke it on many occasions. There was an interesting experience when he was dining with one Simon, Luke chapter 7. And they were probably in an outdoor courtyard at a great banquet type feast. And people along the street, this was common, strange, but common. People coming along the street would not only stop and stare, but they felt at liberty to walk right in. Well, they didn't sit down at the table with them, but they would watch and get close to them as they reclined at the table, putting their left elbow on the low table and stretching their feet out behind them. And this woman did that. And she touched him and poured out the ointment and wet his feet with her hair and dried it with her hair. And Simon said, well, if he were a prophet, he'd know what kind of woman this was. And he wouldn't allow this. And Jesus speaks to that woman, daughter, thy sins have been forgiven. Go your way. Interesting experience of forgiving sin. Question or comment? All right, one other. He is Lord Kyrios over death itself. Notice the wide range. He is Lord over sickness, over demons, over the elements, over sin, and he is Lord even over death. There are 3 occasions, there may have been more, but there are 3 occasions in the Gospels where Jesus raised to life again a person who was dead. You need to be aware of those 3. First of all, there is the instance that I described earlier of Jairus' daughter, the little 12-year-old girl. When he raised her up, she was already dead, but Jesus raised her back to life. And the second one is poignant as well. Jesus encounters a funeral procession, a long line of people going out to a burial place, near the little town of Nain, not far from Nazareth. And they often had a parade like that. Not like the parades they have in New Orleans with the band going, but they would have a flute, at least one flute, because that was the instrument associated with funerals. And so Jesus meets this funeral procession and stops it. Who is it? It is the only son of a widow in Nain. He would have been her only support. We cannot begin to imagine the situation of a woman in Palestine in the first century who had no husband and no children to support her. She would have been utterly destitute. And now Jesus has mercy upon her. He stops that funeral procession and he raises to life again this only son of the widow of Nain. The other one, the third one, is even more familiar to you from the 11th chapter of the book of John. It's in a place very familiar to Jesus, Bethany, which was just over the other side, the eastern side of the Mount of Olives. He had been there many times. I'm sure that he had stayed many times in the home of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. Now, the occasion is, of course, that Jesus had been off in a fairly distant area, probably over what we call Jordan, when he got the word that Lazarus was sick. Your friend Lazarus is very sick. Jesus said, we'll tarry here for a while. And the disciples are puzzled. Why wait? You need to go now. But Jesus waits, and when he gets there, it's been 4 days. And Lazarus is dead. He's been dead 4 days. And interesting superstitions about that among many ancient peoples, even among the Jews of that day, thinking that the spirit of a deceased person would stay around, hang around for about 3 days. Maybe, well, you know, there's some basis in fact for that, because oftentimes they would pronounce somebody dead who wasn't dead, and they were going to wait a while and make sure. You think that's strange? It happens today. I've read about it not too long ago. Somebody who woke up in a mortuary, you know. That's scary. But anyway, that has often happened, and even in medieval times, they would often put a cord inside the vault attached to a bell on the outside. In case you wake up, come get me.
Yes.
Well, those are strange and humorous things, but Lazarus had been dead, and when he talked to Martha about it, and to Mary, and he said, let's go out to the tomb, they were very straightforward and a little bit crass about it. They said, Lord, you don't want to go out there. You know, he's been dead 4 days. What does that mean? Days like the heat of today in Palestine? You don't want to go there, Lord. Well, I've been there to what is reputed to be the tomb of Lazarus, and had the opportunity a number of years ago of climbing down inside that tomb and lying on the burial slab. Now, I don't know that that's really where Lazarus was. May have been. But as I, what? Close, yeah. But as I lay there, I began to think about what was he thinking when he heard his name called. Lazarus, come forth, Jesus said. And Lazarus came out of that tomb. And he's still bound in the grave clothes, and Jesus said, loose him. But those 3 occasions, Jairus' daughter, the son of the widow of Nain, and Lazarus, all raised from the dead by Jesus in his earthly ministry. Any question about that? Any comment?
I think that happens today.
Do I think that happens today? That Jesus raises people from the dead, you mean? I can't answer that. I don't know. I don't know. I think that there are times when we certainly we think every indication that the person is dead. Now, if you're referring to the alleged going to heaven and coming back, my answer to that is, and you'll forgive me for being abrupt about this, it just ain't so. Everything that you can know and need to know about heaven, you find in the Bible. And you don't find it in somebody's novel or their verbal account. Now, I know some of you disagree with that, and I know how powerful those testimonies are. But what you need to know about heaven is right here.
What about demons today?
Demons are real today, yes. They certainly are. Yeah, I think I've encountered some. Yeah. Yes, Susan?
Do you think the little boy that died and went to heaven and came back and talked to his parents and they made a movie? You don't think that happened?
I do not think that's real, no.
That could have just been his dream, that?
No.
I don't know what prompted it. I know that the human mind and subconscious is far deeper and more mysterious than we can imagine. And that in dire moments, such as a death moment, feelings that lie deeply buried in the subconscious can rise to the surface. Okay, Susan, you had a question?
The lady that asked about demons today, do you think that it's because they are evident? They were evident. Okay. They're here today, but that there are counterfeits, or that they're camouflaged, and that we have grown to be complacent?
Well, several things you've said are certainly true. We are complacent. There are some demons that are disguised. In fact, the New Testament plainly says that they can appear as angels of light.
Right.
They can wear disguises. But let me come back to what I said a few minutes ago. I believe that demons are realities. They are spiritual entities that exist today, just as they have always, since history began, existed. There are occasions and there are places where their activity is much more pronounced. Those of us who have visited in areas like the Caribbean, where spiritism is rife, I have encountered there in a revival meeting some of the things that I think were really demonic. And I think there are things going on today that are demonic in our world, prompted by demons. And I really, to go a bit further, I think that demonic activity will probably become more widespread and rife as we approach the very last days of this age. Okay, well, we got a little off there. Any question about that, a comment? Now, you believe what you will about the returning to speak about heaven. The Apostle Paul said, I was caught up into the third heaven, and when I returned, I couldn't talk about it. If Paul couldn't talk about it, he said, these things are unlawful to speak about. So I don't think anybody else ought to be talking about them either. I don't think they're real. Okay, any other comment, question? Well, on that point, we'll stop because it's 7 o'clock. Thank you for being here tonight.